How many have read Autobiography of a Yogi? I read it in 1970 when I was a little boy. And I was at the beginning of my own spiritual path and reading everything I could about the Vedantic tradition and Hinduism and Buddhism. And I was meditating every day. And the book had a big effect on me and influenced my life. But I never became a formal student of Yogananda. I never became a devotee or disciple. I had my own path and my own teachers, and he just became one of many teachers I learned from. And I still have that book, that copy of Autobiography of a Yogi that I read in 1970. And I moved many, many times. I read it when I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I moved across the country, I moved back, and then I moved to LA. And somehow the book is still with me. And I should have brought it to display to prove it. But it's a hardcover, and it says on the cover that it cost $5. And I know that in 1970, I would not have spent $5 on a hardcover book, because that would have meant not eating. But I somehow have that book, so I know that since it was very popular in the circles I traveled in, I probably borrowed it from somebody and never returned it. So I wrote this book to make up for that karma of stealing somebody's book. That's not true. But it's a fun story. But I still do have that copy of the book. But I'm going to explain why I wrote a biography of Yogananda, because the question I have been asked the last few years more than any other question is, why would I write a biography of somebody who is famous throughout the world for his own autobiography? Did you wonder that too? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to explain. When I wrote American Veda, as many of you know, I covered 200 years of history of the Hindu Dharma coming to America, going way back to the early part of the 19th century. So I had to write about all the gurus and yoga masters and Swamijis who have come here over the years. And in that context, I came to more fully appreciate the importance that Yogananda had on bringing Hindu teachings to the West. He was a towering figure in that regard, partly for many, many reasons. But even to this day, because he passed in 1952, but because of the work he did when he was here, from 1920 to 1952, because of the institutions he created that are still functioning and teaching in his name, and largely because of the Autobiography of a Yogi and its continuing popularity all these years later, he's probably the best known and probably the most beloved of all the gurus who came here from India. And there are many good reasons for that. And the other thing I came to appreciate, not only his importance, but his life story. You probably know that in the lives of many Swamijis, we don't know much about their personal life, because they don't speak to that. They're renunciates. But he did, so we know a lot about his life, and I found out more than people knew before. And I became fascinated with the human story of how this child born Mukunda Lal Ghosh in Gorakhpur in 1893 became Paramahansa Yogananda and came to influence so many millions and millions of people all over the world. And that story is really, really interesting. Do we have more problems? Stay close. Oh, God. Okay. Much better?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Can you start from the beginning?
You could just rewind.
Replay, sure. Slow motion.
That story, his human story, became of great interest to me. And when I wrote American Veda, I only had one short chapter to devote to him. And so afterward, I thought maybe I should write a full book about his life and his work. And then I thought, well, somebody must have already done that. And it turned out nobody had done that. There are some books that were written by disciples of his a long time ago, but they're not really biographies. Biographies are different. These were sort of, people's remembrances of being with their guru. And then I thought, but there's Autobiography of a Yogi, so what could I say that's new and different? Well, it turns out that, I don't know when you read Autobiography of a Yogi, but if you read it recently, you may realize a lot of that book is about other people, not Yogananda. It's about great yogis he knew, and many important people and so forth, and about philosophy and Hindu Dharma and life in India. But he leaves out a lot. And he leaves out a lot, especially about his time after he came to America. He came to America in 1920 at age 27. And he was here, except for 1 year in India and 4 months in Europe, for the rest of his life. That's another 32 years before he passed. And this is where he did almost all of his work, and where he became famous throughout the world, and where he wrote his books and established his institutions. And yet, less than 10% of his autobiography is about those years. And there were sentences in the autobiography like, and 4 years passed in Boston. And I thought, that's 4 years. And he wrote it off in 1 or 2 sentences. So somebody has to fill those gaps. And there were other sections like that where he leaves out big chunks of his life and important details about his life here in America, not all of which were pleasant. And so I thought, 4 years in Boston, that's where he first arrived in 1920. That's where he got started. That's where he found his first disciples, where he gave his first public lectures, where he wrote his first books. A lot must have happened in those 4 years. And so there were other sections of his life like that. And I thought, people should know. People should know the whole story. And so I set out to write it. And I got the cooperation I needed. And now there's a book with all the missing details. And it's fascinating when you try to write the life of an important person and an unusual person. The kind of things you can find out. And if you dig hard enough, even if the person died 66 years ago. But I found things that even his most ardent disciples didn't know. And so there are discoveries to be made in the book, but mostly it's a good story of a very unusual and important human being. And I emphasize human being because, as I say in the introduction to the book, you all know that when people become disciples of a great master, they have different ideas about who he was, who he is. And so some people think Yogananda was an avatar, a divine incarnation, born at the highest levels of realization and came to serve. And other people think he was just a great yogi and a great teacher. And there's people who think he was a fraud and everything else in between. But whatever you think of Yogananda, his life was very important in illuminating the Western world to Vedic understanding of life and spirit. And he was a human being. He was a great yogi, a great teacher, but a human being. And he had a unique personality. He came from a family. He had an upbringing. He was influenced by history and culture and the cities that he was raised in India, and of course by his own guru and his guru lineage. And I set out to see what those influences were and what made him who he was. And it's fascinating stuff. I'm going to give you a kind of overview of some of the things, some of the important moments in his life while I show you some slides. And this is, of course, him in 1946 when Autobiography. His father was a railroad executive in the British railway system. He came up from poverty and became an accountant, had a very challenging life, and then became an accountant in the railway system and had a comfortable living. His wife, Yogananda's mother, I should say Mukunda's mother, was apparently a very saintly woman, and both of them were devotees of Lahiri Mahasya, who was a great teacher and became eventually Yogananda's Param Guru, the guru of his own guru. Yogananda was born in 1893 in Gorakhpur, and this is him at age 6. This is the September, and part of our trip will be Kolkata and all the places in the area that young Mukunda frequented and helped him become the person we know as Yogananda. And the family lets us come into the house and see her and look around. And this is a current picture of the little tiny room that Mukunda, at age 13 or 14, made it into his little meditation room. And now it's a bit of a shrine, but they let pilgrims come and sit and meditate in the room. And there's a story here. Attributes about Yogananda that we can say he was influenced by his surroundings and his environment and family and so forth. And one of the things I got very interested in was Calcutta in the early part of the 20th century. Are any of you from Bengal or from Calcutta? Calcutta in those days was really, really fascinating. And the neighborhood that they lived in was, it was the capital in those days before it moved to Delhi, and it was a place of creativity and ferment. It reminds me of in New York, Greenwich Village, where there was a lot of spiritual teachers there, a lot of gurus and ashrams, and sort of revival of new ways of expressing Hindu Dharma. There were creative scientists and scholars and artists in the area doing new and exciting things. It was the really early stages of the freedom movement was centered around Calcutta. This is where, during Yogananda's teenage years, Sri Aurobindo was arrested and put into prison before he became Aurobindo. They were related, by the way. He and Yogananda are distant cousins, both with the name Ghosh. And so the influence of Calcutta on him, and the influence, most of all, of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. Have any of you been to Calcutta? And so maybe you know that the home where Vivekananda grew up, family home, is now a national museum. Well, you can walk from there to this house on Garpar Road. So Yogananda, in his teenage years, was surrounded by the influence of Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna and Sarada Devi, who was still alive, and all the monks, the swamis in that lineage. And right up the road was Dakshineswar, and the Kali temple where Sri Ramakrishna held forth and was famous, where Vivekananda met him, across the river from Bellarmith, where the Ramakrishna mission is. And all this was part of Yogananda's growing up. You know the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna by M, the person known as M? Well, M was one of teenage Yogananda's mentors, spiritual teacher of his. And he would take him to Dakshineswar, and as a teenager, Yogananda would meditate in the temple and sit where Ramakrishna did. So that influence was important on his growing up, as were other teachers in the area. But there was a part of him that was sort of, his dharma to become the spiritual leader was so obvious. It must have been part of his, birthright. Because he set up a room like this when he was just 13. And even before this, when they had other homes in other cities, when they'd move, the first thing he would do was set up an altar somewhere where he could sit in seclusion and do Kali pujas and meditate. And he would go, in Calcutta, he would go to every guru and every swami and every teacher and learn yogic methods from them, and then start teaching them to his friends. This is not the sort of thing most 13-year-olds do, as you know. I don't know what it was like in India, but here, when you're a teenager, there's always people who are leaders, ringleaders we call them, instigators. They would be the ones who threw a party, or organized a soccer team, or led a group into some kind of mischief or another. Yogananda was that guy. He was very athletic as a kid, and he would organize foot races and things like that. But mostly, he was organizing satsangs. He was a teenager, and he had his friends come and sit in that room and meditate and go to temples for festivals and organize seva projects and organize teachings and have gurus come to meet with them. That's what he did as a teenager. At 15, he established his first ashram. The father of one of his companions gave them a little hut in the neighborhood. That hut is now it's a building with a center in Yogananda's lineage, a few blocks from that house. And so he had an ashram with a spiritual library when he was 15. And when he was 17, they started a school. based, on Vedic principles to, teach kids. So he was destined for this kind of spiritual leadership role right as a young man, and it was fascinating to sort of trace that story and tell all about his adventures as a young man. And he was very fiercely independent. He was not going to do what he was told. His father was a wonderful man. His mother died when he was 11, which had a very big impact on him. And some of you may know, he tried to run away to the Himalayas 3 or 4 times when he was in his, not even a teenager. The first time he tried that, he was 11. And he tried again at 13, and other times he ran away from home. He got on trains, he was going to head to the Himalayas and be a yogi or find a guru. But his family always tracked him down. Once he got as far as Haridwar, but never any friend. At a certain point, his father really wanted him to have a normal life. And this is him at 16, looking like a fierce young yogi. This is him with his older brother, who tragically passed away when Yogananda was just after high school, after college, I think. And so Yogananda, or then Mukunda, became the eldest son of 8, or now 7, and the father wanted him to live a normal life, and they tried to arrange marriage for him 3 times, and he said, no, thank you very much. And after he graduated college, his father, he didn't like school very much. He rebelled against classwork, and he just wanted to study the sacred texts and hang around with gurus and meditate and attain realization. He was dead set on that as a very, very young man. But he did it. He went to high school and college because his guru and his father insisted. And then his father said, I can give you a really good job and a marriage. And he said no. And wasn't going to be. And he found his own guru. That, as you may know, is Sri Teswar, who became his guru right after, when they met, after he finished high school. And he said, I want to be your disciple, I want to be wherever you are. And he said, well, that's fine, but first finish college. And so like a lot of other young devotees, the guru said, no, you need an education. And in his case, the reason was very explicit. Lahiri Mahasya, who is Sri Teswar's guru in this lineage of Kriya Yoga masters, had always said that he would that Sri Teswar would have a disciple who would bring the teachings of that lineage to the West. And Sri Teswar recognized Yogananda as that person, and he said, you'll be taken more seriously in America if you have a college degree. And so he managed to get by the skin of his teeth, as we say, and graduated. A few years, maybe only 2 years. The first thing he did when he became a Swami was to start a school, and the school got some funding from a Maharaja, and they moved the school to Ranchi. And that property still exists in Yogananda's lineage. You can visit it. It's now not only a school, but sort of headquarters of his Yoga Satsanga Society. And then he felt the call that it was time to come to America. And how that happened, and the circumstances that had to fall into play for him to be able to come, for him to have a destination, for him to even get a passport in 1920. Just a wonderful sequence of events that I loved writing about and learning about, but it's a great story, and it makes you think, there was a bigger hand at play here, because too many coincidences, or what seemed to be coincidences, had to happen for him to get here. On the first boat to come, first passenger ship to come from India to America since before World War I. By now it was 1920, the war was over, and this was a passenger ship, and it was completely booked. He managed to get on, and he managed to get the money from his father, and he managed to get an invitation to speak at a religious event, or sort of interfaith event in Boston in 1920. And it was called the Congress of Religious Liberals. And this is his passport picture. So, do you notice anything distinctive? What? Yeah, there's a turban. What else?
Beard.
Beard. Did you ever see a picture of Yogananda with a beard? No. But that's his passport picture. That's what it looked like at age 27 when he got his passport. He sailed from Calcutta to Boston, and on this day, September 20th, 1920, this was an article in the Boston Globe about the interesting people that just arrived on this ship, including Swami Yogananda. And look, no beard. Why? Because on the ship, he met some nice American people. They asked him to speak on the ship, actually, and he gave a speech in English and got over his fear that his English wouldn't be good enough to give public talks in America. He was very self-conscious about it, but he gave a speech in English on the ship. And some nice Americans said, you know, you're going to stand out on the streets of America with your long hair and your orange clothing. Maybe you want to modify your appearance so you mocked and teased and harassed on the streets quite so much. This is 1920. This is 45 years before the immigration laws changed so all of you could become citizens. There was no citizens from India at that time. Very few Indians at all. Some swamis in the Ramakrishna lineage, some yoga teachers, some scholars and students, but not many people. And he was going to be a dark-skinned man with long hair and strange clothing, walking the streets of a city where, you know, they weren't used to having Jews and Catholics around yet, let alone, you know, and it was very racist at the time. Ku Klux Klan was very popular in those days, and it was a much more racist even than now. And so they said, maybe you should shave your beard and you'll look less threatening to people. So he did, but he refused to cut his hair. I'm telling you stories like this because I thought you would really appreciate some of these things about how he had to adapt to America. And so he shaved his beard, and he learned after a while, after some tough experiences, to modify his appearance when he was out in public. So here he is, for example, with the other speakers at that Congress. And of course you can see, except for the Chinese or Japanese looking man, everybody else is a Westerner. But he refused, he didn't cut his hair. That would have been too much a violation of the Swami life, but he did shave his beard. And after a while, he would occasionally, when he was out in public, just to make life easier, he would wear Western clothing. So he had some suits and ties. He never wore ties, really. He wore suits and collarless shirts and, you know, Western shoes, and even, you know, Western hats. And he would, there's pictures of him with a fedora hat. And you can see he would always wear a scarf. And he would pull his hair back and tuck it under his collar, or pull it up under his hat. so it looked like he had a regular American haircut. And there's a funny story because a picture of him looking like that got back to India, and his guru, Sri Yukteswar, said, oh, he's gone American, he's cut his hair. And Yogananda was so upset that his guru would think he cut his hair that he quickly had pictures of him with his long hair showing and to send to India so his guru would be pleased to know that he didn't cut his hair. And I'm going to show you some footage from 1931 of Yogananda and some of his Western devotees. These are people from Boston, very respectful citizens, out of respect for him, walking in the streets of New York in Indian-style clothing. I always expect to see Charlie Chaplin. By the way, you should know, there are about a dozen CDs, because toward the end of his life there was recording technology, and Self-Realization Fellowship had them, talks of his, digitized, so you can get CDs of some of his talks and conversations with devotees. And this is from one of them, and I chose this one because it was on YouTube, but also because he talks, it's a funny story about his appearance and how people reacted to it.
When I was once coming from New York to Los Angeles dressed this way, the movie actor was sitting in front of me. He was extremely disgusted with my long hair and this robe. He was openly sarcastic. But I was highly amused. I knew to be angry with him would be childish, and to let him go on being angry was also foolish, so I thought of healing him. I said, pardon me, why did you make such a face? He said, none of your business. I said, of course it's my business, because every time I look at it, I have to see your face. So he started laughing. He said, to what expression you are. I said, we will understand each other in a little while. I said, you know, in this world, we are all a little bit crazy and we don't know it. Because crazy people are the same kind, mixed with the same kind of crazy people. And I said, I know about your craziness. And if I were crazy like you, you would like me. And if you were crazy like I am, then we would like each other. But the thing is this, I know about your craziness, but you don't know what kind of craziness I have. And fools argue and wise men discuss. Let us discuss, and if at the end of the discussion, constructive discussion, I lose, I will probably even be a movie actor. And I said, if you lose, you foul me. So we had a 2-hour discussion, and at the end of 2 hours he lost, and I won, and I was saved from being a movie actor.
He spent those first 4 years in Boston, and it was fascinating to see how he got his first disciples, American disciples, and how he learned to advertise his talks, and how he learned to change the title of his public talks so it would attract more Americans. He was adapting to a new culture, a new time and place. And eventually, in 1924, he set out from New York, having attained a certain amount of fame. He started out just lecturing to whoever would show up in someone's living room, 10, 12 people, to eventually filling large concert halls, including Carnegie Hall and Boston Symphony Hall and places like that. And And so in 1924, he felt it was time to head to the West Coast. He, for some reason, always knew Los Angeles would be the place where, if he was going to have a permanent presence in America, it would be in LA, which he thought of as the Benares of America. And so he set out on a cross-country tour with 3 of his students, including one man from India, a Muslim man from India who did the organizing of his talks. And this was a time before there was interstate highways in America. Automobiles were just becoming affordable to the masses, and the roads were not very good, and there weren't many services. And if he was looked on as a strange-looking man in New York, you can imagine what it would have been like in Ohio and Nebraska and all those places. And so it was quite an adventure for them. And he came to love America and love the American landscape. And he wrote a lot of poetry about the mountains of Colorado and the Yellowstone Park and all that sort of thing. And ended up spending time, once he got to the West, giving public lectures and teaching classes and gathering disciples and students in that way on this long trip for about 6 months in 1924. And this is him in Denver. If you could just get a sense of how he looked and the kind of advertising there was. I don't know if you could read it, but it says, "Free lecture by Swami Yogananda, renowned lecturer, educator, and psychologist from India." And Concentration and Life Force was the title of this one. There were a lot of titles promising different things from yogic methodologies. And that was the strategy, to give a free public lecture and then followed by classes where he would impart yogic techniques and more yogic knowledge from his Kriya Yoga tradition, and people would pay for those, and that's how income was generated for his organization right from the beginning. And eventually, after having a side trip to Alaska and going to Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and going down the West Coast, he ended up in LA. And this was the ad for his first public lecture at Philharmonic Auditorium on January 13th, 1925. Illustrious Hindu savant and seer, educator, psychologist, and metaphysician, representative of the Maharaja of Kazimbazar, Bengal, India. First lecture, Mastering the Subconscious by Superconsciousness. Here, an inspired emissary sent by a Maharaja with a flaming message of soul-stirring power. That was how advertising was in 1925. But Philharmonic Auditorium seats 3,000 people, and 6,000 showed up. And that's not apocryphal, that's from the LA Times the next day. And they had to turn people away. And he had a whole series of lectures and classes, and that's really how things got started for him in LA, and led to, prominent citizens became students of his, so they stepped up and found, put up money for renting facilities, and then eventually purchasing the property on top of Mount Washington. How many of you have been there? This was I always say Yogananda had the best real estate karma of all the gurus who came here. So if you've been to their properties in Southern California, and even in India, in Dakshineswar and Ranchi and places, they have beautiful properties, all beautifully located and maintained. And here, this was the first, on top of Mount Washington in downtown LA. They found it in 1925. It had been a luxury hotel, and when it had gone out of business, it was abandoned, and they bought that property. and it became their headquarters, and it still is. In 2 years' time, no, in 7 years' time, it will be 100 years. And it became, now they have 800 centers in the world, and it's all administered from this same property. Additions have been made, and upgrades have been made. But this is them at the first gathering on Easter Sunday in 1925 in Mount Washington. And everything grew from there. He was on the road. People don't realize this, but he was on the road almost constantly for the first few years. That, even after they had a permanent facility in Los Angeles, he was on trains going across the country and back all the time, and speaking to people, establishing centers, getting students, training students to be leaders in their area. It was a big enterprise, and it wasn't always pleasant. And this is something I really want to emphasize, because I emphasized it in my book. Somehow people get the impression that the life of a great master like Yogananda would be easy and everything would happen without difficulty. But it's not the case. There were scandals, there were accusations in the press, there were people who wanted to bring him down because he became the most famous Indian spiritual teacher in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And there were, conservative Christians and other people wanted to bring him down, and they did. The newspapers, we didn't invent fake news recently. This goes back a long way. It used to be called yellow journalism, and they would pick up on anything, any rumor, and it would be the front pages. And this is the kind of thing that he dealt with. He had to manage people who were not always qualified to do what anybody who's run a volunteer organization knows, that it's not always easy. And he wasn't trained, he wasn't an MBA, he had to run an enterprise that was growing. The Depression hit in 1929. Businesses were going bankrupt, people were personally going bankrupt. He had a property, a mortgage to pay, and he was worried about money all the time, right up until close to his own passing. Will there be enough money to sustain the organization, to keep it growing, to pay the bills, to feed the disciples who were working? He worried about that a lot. He had to manage people. He had lawsuits. There were two major lawsuits, one at the end of the 20s, one at the end of the 30s, both filed by fellow Indians who had turned on him and had worked with him and worked for him and had turned on him and sued. And there were all these things got in the newspapers. There were rumors. There was all kinds of stuff that he had to deal with constantly. It was not easy. And there were times when he saw, I don't really want to do this anymore. This is not what I signed up for. And I just want to go back to India. And he said he would pray to Divine Mother to let him go back to India and serve her as a simple monk. And every time she said, no, you have a job to do, and so he persevered. And it's really inspiring to see that, there was always this part of him that just wanted to be in an ashram, or walk on the Ganges with the other sadhus, and be a sannyasi, living a simple life. But he had a mission that was given him by his lineage, and he took it very seriously and worked very hard, and had others working very hard for him. So I just wanted to point that out. There were scandals like this. Miami at that time was not the sophisticated city it is then. It was really part of the Deep South, and this is the late 20s. It was a very racist time in America, and especially in the South. And Yogananda was successfully teaching there for a while, and most of his students were women. as like you see in yoga classes, today. And the men, their families were threatened by that. They thought the gurus had powers of mind, and they would hypnotize the innocent American women and have their way with them. And there was all this fear and racism. It was very terrible stuff. And so they wanted him to leave, and they threatened him, and his life was in danger. He refused. He hired a lawyer, but eventually people convinced him that it was for his own safety to leave. So there's that, and another lawsuit, and all kinds of stuff. And often, as I said, he wanted to leave, and he got very angry at these things. It was very emotional for him. And to his credit, he didn't hide those feelings. I had access to a lot of his letters, his personal letters, and some of them were very moving about the difficulties and tribulations he had. But I should also say that while he was a renunciate and a monk, he also was very, not only engaged in the world because he had a mission to fulfill, and that to be essentially an entrepreneur, spiritual entrepreneur and a CEO, but he also enjoyed the pleasures of life. He liked music, he liked travel, he loved sightseeing, and he'd buy souvenirs and remembrances. And you could see some of them at these little exhibits at the Lake Shrine in Pacific Palisades and elsewhere. He collected things. He loved sightseeing and practical jokes and ice cream, and so he was participated in the world and enjoyed the pleasures, but also suffered a lot of the difficulties and challenges of life, and was also very aware of world affairs. And so in those difficult years of the Depression and World War II, he often spoke out. And he was a huge admirer of Gandhi's and a big supporter of the Indian independence movement. And he spoke out about that at some risk, because remember, he was a British subject. He was traveling on a British passport as a subject of the British Empire. And he could have been deported at any time. And the British were spying on him. This is one of the things I discovered. There are letters showing that the British consulates were sending people to check him out. He was getting famous, and they wanted to know if he was one of those people secretly sending money to Gandhi. And there was always the threat that he could be sent back to India as a subversive, and they found him acceptable in some way. Back to India for that one trip in 1935 and 6, exactly a year in India. It was very moving to write about that. I have a chapter about his year in India. And he saw his father for the last time. He saw his guru, Sri Yukteswar. This is them together in 1935, and Sri Yukteswar passed while Yogananda was in India. There's some miraculous stories around that you'll have to read about. And it was very moving stuff. He saw his siblings again, and nieces and nephews whom he had never met or were infants when he left 15 years before. It was really sweet to write about all that. His father was old and ailing, and he knew that he would probably never see him again, and he didn't. And he visited with Gandhi, and there's a whole chapter in his autobiography about that visit. And I thought, when it turned out that he was detained when he returned from India. He was detained at New York Harbor for 3 or 4 days, not allowed entry. And it had been a mystery all these years to certain people who followed his life. Why was he detained? And some people thought, well, it's because there was a lawsuit. One of those lawsuits hadn't yet been fully settled, so maybe that's why. Or maybe because he visited with Gandhi, and they wanted to check him out to make sure he was not going to be spreading revolutionary ideals in America. Or maybe it was for some other reason, having to do with money and transfer of funds. So I tried to find out why. And my hunch was it was about his support of Gandhi. So I contacted the National Archives, and they looked into it. And I had a copy of this form that was filled out for all the people who were detained, and he was on the list. He was not the only one. And it had all these symbols on it that I didn't understand. And neither did they, but they showed it to one of the historians who deciphered it and looked into the record. And it turns out that his re-entry visa had expired. And that's why they detained him. It was as simple as that. He had delayed his return trip and didn't renew his visa, so they had to wait. It was really very simple, but I was happy to clear up that mystery. And then when he returned, as some of you know, his wealthy disciple, a very important figure in Yogananda's story, without whom, his name was James Lynn. He was a very wealthy businessman from Kansas City, who became his closest disciple and his appointed successor. They gave him the name Rajarsi Yogananda. But he was a wealthy man whose wealth survived the Depression, and he wrote big checks when needed and paid off mortgages and bought the property in Encinitas. How many have been to Encinitas, to the property there? If you have a chance, go. It's a beautiful, beautiful property on the cliffs above the ocean. This was a temple that was built that collapsed a few years later. It's no longer there. But the property still exists and is beautiful and maintained. And this is him at his writing desk in Encinitas. After the trip to India, he pretty much scaled back on his travels. And in the last 10 or 12 years of his life, he had his eye on his legacy. He had other people doing the traveling and teaching. He had trained them. And his job now, he felt, he always knew he would not live long. Not live a long life. And those last 10 or 12 years, he was deeply immersed in writing. So he was writing not just Autobiography of the Yogi, which of course became his most famous work, but commentaries on Bhagavad Gita, which are like now a 2-volume, 1,200-page thing. All of his writings about Jesus, because he really had a lot to say about a different way of interpreting Jesus and the Christ message, and all kinds of other writing and limited public speaking and time with his closest disciples to make sure his legacy would be ensured after he departed. And he was always, as I said, worried about money and trying to establish the financial foundation for the future of the work and the institutional framework. So he was really, really working very hard, but without traveling outside of Southern California for those last 10 or 12 years. And eventually published this book, which is, of course, now a classic of spiritual literature. And this is the opening of the Lake Shrine on Pacific Palisades in 1950. How many have been to the Lake Shrine on Sunset Boulevard? It's one of the great oasis, or like an oasis in LA. It's a wonderful place to bring people who are visiting from other parts of the country. And if you have friends or family visiting from India, I highly recommend going and walking around the Lake Shrine and seeing a little piece of Indian heritage. In the last night of his life, how many know the story about how his passing? I have to say, it's an extraordinary thing. I took great satisfaction writing this book and learned a lot myself that helps me in my own life. And there were certain sections of his life that were especially moving for me to write about. The most moving was the last few days of his life and the circumstances leading up to his passing. I just loved working on that, and it was very emotional, because there were accounts of those last few days from his disciples, and I pieced it all together and told the story. And it's really fascinating. He knew he didn't have long. He knew he was going. And he had always said, and I take pleasure telling this audience this story, he really loved India, and he missed India. It was, always Mother India, always homeland. And he always wanted to go again. It took him 15 years in the West before he made his one trip there, and he always thought he'd go back. And he had actually purchased passage on more than one occasion, but circumstances didn't allow it, and then his health wouldn't allow it, and he never did get back. But he always loved, his heart was in India. And he said that he would, there's an expression in America you may have heard that about dying with your boots on. It means you'll die doing your work. And he said he would die with his boots on, speaking about India, with India on his tongue. And that's what happened. The last night of his life, the first ambassador to the U.S. after Indian independence was visiting LA, and Yogananda, as the most prominent Indian citizen, hosted him, the ambassador and his wife. That's the wife, Mrs. Sen. I don't have any pictures of the ambassador. And they took him to the lake shrine, and they took him, had dinners for them. And this was a banquet at the Hotel Biltmore in downtown LA. And Yogananda was to be the keynote speaker. And there were a lot of interesting circumstances leading up to that night that were interesting to write about and that you'll find interesting to read about. And he gave the keynote. And this was the last picture ever taken of him. So on the cover of my book is the first picture, the earliest picture and the last picture. This is known by his devotees as the last smile. And he gave his talk at the banquet, and he concluded by reading passages from his own poem called My India. That's essentially a long poem about his love for India and how wonderful India was and so forth. And he read a few lines and collapsed and died. And so his own prophecy of dying with India on his lips actually came true, which is, if I made that up, people would think that's going too far. But it really happened. And there it is. So I wrote about it. And just so you know, if you want to let people back in India know that this biography exists, this is the Indian cover. And the Indian title, it's different. It's published in India by the same. That's an overview of Yogananda's life and why I wrote it, and I think what you'll find most satisfying about it. And of course, we'll be selling copies of it and American Veda in the back. And if anybody you know wants to go on our trip to India in September, or any of your relatives and friends in Delhi or Calcutta or Mumbai or Rishikesh want to say hello to my American group, let me know.